This is session 2 of the first module in Design to Disrupt program that Tinkerers Lab and Maker Foundation has collaborated to bring to you. My name is Anurag Meral, and I'm a professor at School of Medicine at Stanford. I also have a faculty role at School of Business. I'm involved with the Center for Biodesign, and the methodology that we are talking about in this program is from that center. I'm also involved with Center for Global Health. And lastly, I'm also associated outside of Stanford in a for-profit organization called Ortiz Medical, which is a strategy consulting firm focusing on healthcare worldwide. The main objective of this program, as we had discussed last week, was really to give you all an exposure to design thinking, which is a methodology, which is a framework for solving problems. That's what it is at the end of the day. It's a very simple methodology, actually. A lot of common sense in it, but as they say, common sense can be fairly uncommon. And we end up, especially those of us in engineering community, and I'm an engineer myself, an IIT Bombay alum, we tend to rush to a solution with the technology that we have in hand. And the main objective of this program is to help you see, help you learn this methodology that allows you to first understand the problem, first and foremost, before you jump into a solution. So I'm going to recap what we did last week, and then we're going to today focus on needs finding, the first step in biodesign methodology. And then we're going to do a working session where you'll get to know your team and you'll do some secondary research on unmet needs during COVID-19. And then we'll talk about plans for week 2. Here's the structure of the program. First module is all about learning the basics of the methodology, key concepts of design thinking and biodesign process. About 10 hours of didactic instruction. Really, it's 8 hours if you can get that in 4 sessions. I realize that's not enough time. I mean, when I teach these programs, it's usually 10 sessions over 10, 12 weeks. So we're trying to compress everything into these 4 weeks. But I think you're ready for the introductory part, and then there's a module 2 where we'll dig into this some of this more. There is an expectation that each week you spend 3 to 5 hours outside of the class here to do some work. And I don't know if you had a chance to do that during the first week. I would strongly recommend that you make that time to do the homework, because otherwise you would not get as much from this the module 1. You are pre-assigned into groups of up to 6. It's important for you to get to know each other and work together on that. And then module 2 would be really much more a hands-on module, lot of learn by doing, and we'll really focus on identifying specific need that you work on with specific prototypes and testing of those prototypes. It gets into much more into that, basically. So that's really module 2. I'll quickly mention who the teams are, and you already should have this in your inbox. I think it's been sent to you. So there are 9 groups, and I'm just gonna quickly flash through so you can see yourselves again. This is what the breakout session is going to be today as well. I'm just gonna spend just a minute each on each of these slides or 15 seconds each other, because we have limited time. Okay. Group 7, group 8, hopefully you can see yourselves. And this is the last group 9. All right, and if you have any questions, please send a message to Adesh or Harshita as to who your other group members are. But you're going to be together in a group, in a breakout session anyway. I'm just going to recap from last week, and then we'll do a breakout session, okay? What we talked about last week was design thinking methodology, and these were the 5 steps, and we played through a video, a very funny video from University of Florida, where this gentleman kind of pops into every user's bedside, mostly focused on healthcare, and try and understand if, I think there was a garbage truck worker also in that video, where this gentleman is trying to understand their perspective. So that's really empathize. And that was the focus of the session last week. Empathize is the first step. You understanding your user is the first very important step before you understand their need. Once you empathize with the user, you define what their needs are. And this is where the rigor starts to come in really. I mean, both empathize, there's a process and methodology for empathization, but also when you're starting to define their problems, their needs, there's a lot more rigor that comes in. So that's defined, and part of what we're going to discuss today is that. And then you do ideate. You start to come up with ideas around that need. But you don't do that until you've done empathization, until you've done define. You truly have to get that right before you ideate. You get to the ideate stage, and I'll mention in a moment why. Then you go to prototype. So based on your idea, whatever your idea is, and you show dozens or hundreds of ideas at some point, but at least dozens of ideas, and you prototype around some of the top ones, and you test them. And there are a lot of different ways of testing these prototypes, and we'll talk about that in future sessions. And if by testing you realize that the solution doesn't really do what it's supposed to do, you go back to ideate, prototype, test, that loop. Thing is, that loop can be an infinite loop if you don't get your empathy and your empathization and your definition of the problem statement right. So in biodesign methodology, which is based on design thinking, we basically taken that 5-step process split into 3 stages. The first stage is identify, where we do needs finding and needs screening. Really problem statement definition, the first 2 parts of the design thinking process. And then we do the invent part, which is the ideation, prototyping, and testing to a certain extent. And that's all of that happens in invent. So concept generation, concept screening, it's kind of an iterative process. And if you notice, there are a lot of iterations happening in these stages. There is some return to the previous stage that does happen if you haven't gotten things right, and you'll know when you haven't gotten things right based on the framework that you would develop. And then once you've gotten to a concept that you know really does the job that you have set out to do, you do implement. A key component of, the most important component of biodesign methodology, similar to design thinking framework overall, is needs identification. If you get that right, if you get your needs finding right and your needs screening right, and you pick the right need, likelihood of your success goes up dramatically. And biodesign, Certified Biodesign's experience shows that plenty. In the US itself, we've had 50 plus companies that have come out of the program last 20 years. And we have deployed this process now worldwide, including in India, with AIMS and IIT Delhi. In the last 12 years, a dozen or so companies have come out of there. That have been phenomenal work, but same thing has happened in other countries, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, parts of Europe, many parts of Europe, and now Africa and Latin America. So it's a methodology. It's a very simple methodology, as you can see, but the main difference is the rigor by which you do the methodology, to really implement the methodology. So it gives you the structure. So if you want to be an entrepreneur as an engineer in life sciences or any field for that matter, I would argue that having a structured approach to something like this would be quite useful, regardless of what your problem area is. I'm on the advisory board of a company called InternMart right now, which is using this methodology to understand unmet needs amongst the high school kids, bringing internship opportunities to them. And the team has really done a rigorous job, and they have done invent part. They are now in the implementation phase, but they keep going back to invent, and they keep iterating on the concept a little bit. So this can be used in a lot of different fields. We also did this empathy workshop last week, and I don't know how many of you, I think most of you had a chance to do this, because I got some really great comments from you in the chat window. And Harshita and Adish, I would love to get a copy of that chat transcript, because you all had some really good questions, you all had really good observations. And what I had asked you to do is to pair up within your own group, and one person would basically be the peer who actually walks you through their typical day during COVID-19. And then everybody else would sort of pay attention to what this peer is saying, what the peer is doing, eye movement, hand movement, and not just the words, but also, so that's the observe part. And then think part and feel part was your interpretation or your inference of it. So what is the peer thinking? What's the peer really feeling? And that sort of empathy development is really critical. And we as engineers haven't been taught that before. I don't remember ever having a class on empathy when I was in my undergrad or master's or PhD. So we don't do this automatically or naturally. So I think it takes a little bit of an effort, and that's part of the reason why we had done the workshop. And during this module 1 itself, you're gonna get a chance to practice that. And I want you to really think about this empathy part really carefully and try and get into their shoes. And I'd asked this question last time, which what is the difference between empathy and sympathy? And you guys have correctly answered. Sympathy is all about what you feel for the other person. It's your feeling, your reaction to what somebody else's condition may be. Empathy is you being in their shoes, you trying to get into their shoes, thinking from their perspective. Not so. Sympathy is all about you. Empathy is all about them. So that's the difference, and that's why don't conflate the two. Empathy is all about what the other person is feeling, getting into their shoes, and thinking from their point of view. When I was leading this organization called Path, their technology solutions global program. I would often ask my team members, 120 team members who work on these different kinds of solutions, I would ask them to leave one chair empty in the conference room that they had in Seattle, because they were working on problems focused on women, children, vulnerable in Africa and other parts of the world. And though they were not present in the room, they couldn't call in, right? So my recommendation to them was to leave a chair empty in the room and think of them being present there. So you constantly push yourself to think from a user's point of view or beneficiary's point of view. And that's a very important element of design thinking. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay. So deliverables from last week, which is what I'm going to ask you to do in the breakout session that we are about to start. Basically, I wanted you to do secondary research on unmet needs amongst the underserved in India during COVID-19. And I had suggested use Google, use news reports, journal articles, videos, social media. You could go to a lot of different sources. And I wanted you to, in this meeting, I wanted you to present the findings. But I suspect a lot of you did not get a chance to actually connect with your teams. So what we have done is we've changed today's structure to actually do a breakout session up front, where you can actually meet with the team and do some of this work that needs to be done. I would ask you all to put together a one-slide presentation on 1 or 2 or 3, at the most 3, on using Google, Google's tool. I don't know what Google Present or Google Slides or whatever it's called. But basically keep it very simple, very, very simple. Don't make it too graphically nice or whatever, but I really want you to present the background of the condition, background of the situation in India. What are the challenges that you found? Who the key stakeholders are? What are the places where you can go and learn more about these folks? And who are the folks you should interview or if you can visit, right? Hopefully, my feeling is visit is not going to be feasible. If this was during non-COVID times, actually, I would make you go to those places, to Dharavi and other places that you could go to. So that's what I would like you guys to do. But before we jump into that breakout session, I do want to bring up a discussion. And actually, let me see if I can pull up the chat window for myself, because I would love to see what other questions that are coming up. Okay, all right, it's here in front of me now. As it comes up, I'll see what you're saying. But some of you actually asked this question through your TAs. What do we mean by underserved? What's my definition of underserved? Actually, let me put that question back to you. I already gave some examples of basically anybody who's vulnerable in India. So once you think about who the vulnerable are, and then share your responses. We talked about the poor in the villages. We talked about folks in the villages, whether they're poor or rich. We talked about poor in the cities. We talked about urban slums. We talked about old and isolated folks. We talked about the children, although it seems like during COVID-19, children don't seem to be as susceptible, but maybe they are, right? Those who have other underlying comorbidities that makes them vulnerable or at risk of this condition, of death from this condition, right, COVID-19. So there are a lot of different ways of framing who the underserved are, as far as COVID-19 is concerned. What I want you, each of the groups, there are nine of you, 9 groups on this call. I want you to think from your own group's perspective, which group do you want to focus on? Who for you is the vulnerable population, or the underserved population rather? Underserved is probably the right way to frame it. Because you're going to do most of your research, most of your needs finding and potential concept that you come up with on that group. So you need to make that choice today. We shouldn't move forward without that. So let me see if there are any thoughts on, beyond the groups that we talked about, if there are any specific examples of the underserved group. And any questions or any comments or any, go ahead and type in the chat window if any ideas come up as to who, for example, in your own group, who do you think you're gonna really focus on? You should talk about it amongst your fellow team members, but just any thoughts about who you would want to focus on? Who do you feel most empathetic towards? Any thoughts? Yeah, what is meant by potential immersion site? That's another term. So immersion is a term that we use for doing observations. So there are multiple ways. So the needs finding is something that you do by making observations. So what you do is when you're doing the empathization and definition part, or needs finding, as it's called in biodesign methodology, you have to, understand your users, right? And there are multiple ways of understanding them. Secondary research that I'm asking you to do today is one element of it. Second element of it is actually calling them or doing surveys with them, whoever the stakeholders are. And stakeholders could be the government, it could be the beneficiaries, the underserved in this case, it could be private sector organizations, it could be NGOs. So it could be a lot of different stakeholders. But picking up the phone or doing a survey with them, just to get the size of the problem and so on, that's the second part of observation, if you will. The third and probably the most effective part of the observation is what is called immersion. Immersion means that you go to that setting where the challenges are, and actually you have a bird's eye view, a fly on the wall view of what the challenges are. So for example, if migrant workers who were forced to go from big cities to rural areas in India was the population that you focus on, you would actually be part of the migrant group that went from their homes in these big cities, Delhi, Mumbai, wherever, and were pushed into these buses or had to walk hundreds of miles back to their home. You would actually be part of the journey, and so that would be an immersion. And at Stanford Biodesign, our fellows do hundreds of hours of immersion in the clinic, in the OR, in community health clinics, and the triage rooms. So whichever settings where your beneficiaries and end users and their stakeholders are going to be at, you spend time and you immerse yourself there. And there's a whole methodology around it, how you do immersion. Because of COVID-19, you won't be able to do actual physical immersion. What I would recommend that you do is you try to simulate that immersion, figure out a way to do that immersion. And I would love to see what ideas come up from different groups. Very open to learning about your ideas as to how you're going to do it. So Nisha just had a very good response to my question, who the underserved are. She says, anyone who has the lack of services they need are underserved. It can also be like a middle class. Absolutely. So a middle class family who's got actually one of my ORBC members, her grandmother, who's like 90 something years old, had a stroke. She was in Mumbai, Navi Mumbai actually. She could not get access to doctors. She was a red zone or whatever it's called. She actually was brought to the hospital for stroke treatment, and they wanted to, and the family members couldn't be there with her, and they had to make choices around this old woman, grandma, what therapy they do. Do they do IVTPA for clot busting, or do you do mechanical thrombectomy, which is like a really high-end procedure? And we basically had to activate clinicians in various hospitals, including in the US, to actually sort through that. I mean, this old lady was fortunate that she had access to her granddaughter and to me and to others to help with that. But I mean, imagine that being another grandma who doesn't have access to all of that. So that's definitely that's underserved. So your comment here is correct, Nisha. So does that resonate with you all? How, what underserved really is, and you can define. I mean, it's very much up to you within the group to pick which stakeholder group which underserved community you focus on. Because then once you pick that underserved community, you have to then think about who are the different stakeholders who have a role to play. I want to make sure that you understand that as well. Who stakeholders are typically anybody who has a role to play. So if you're talking about migrant workers, who do you think are the underserved? Yeah, I'm reading you. That's a good comment as well. Malnutrition of migrant children, absolutely. Anxiety and fear due to COVID pandemic. Yeah, you all could potentially be underserved, but you aren't, because you have the resources, hopefully access to resources for advice and guidance and addressing of your anxiety. But there may be folks who may have anxiety because of potential job loss from COVID-19. So that also, or children who are not socially engaging with each other, and the mental health. In fact, one of my teams that I'm mentoring here in the Bay Area is focusing on that mental health among high school students during COVID-19. So that could potentially be. So it can be pretty expansive. So and there are different degrees of underserved, right? So you have to pick which underserved community you pick on. My recommendation is to pick an underserved group that's as far away from your own reality as possible, because I'm trying to get you to think from other people's point of view, put yourself in the shoes of the other, and as far removed that group is from your own context, and don't pick another NIIT group of IIT students, right? My recommendation would be that. But if you find within IIT community, IIT Bombay community, there are stakeholders that there's a group that is really underserved, and you can make that as well. But definitely, I'll map out the stakeholder group as well. Seems like one of the groups has already worked on the research. What are you supposed to engage during the session? I would say you dig in. I'm actually gonna go from group to group, and I'm gonna work with you, and we'll see how much progress you've made. If on an average everybody has made sufficient progress, similar to what Group 9 is talking about, then we will end the session, the breakout session early, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the didactic portion of today's class, which is needs finding itself. So let's set it up for 30 minutes. Adesh and Harshita, and then we can extend that if need be, or we can truncate it if everybody makes good progress. So Group 9, I'm going to come to your group and I'm going to look at what you have done. And I have one recommendation I have for you, your group, is go deeper. Start to look at where the needs are with a more zoomed in lens. Start to kind of, at the end of your needs finding exercise in the next week, we can have 2 weeks, you can have hundreds of observations. How many observations have you been able to do based on your secondary research? If you've been able to do 1 or 2 or 3, I would suggest try to get dozens of observations from your secondary research. If you've already done dozens, try to get, because we do ultimately want to have hundreds, and I'll tell you why that is important. From those hundreds of observations, you'll have dozens of need statements. Many of those observations will combine. For example, an observation would be, migrant community, let's say focusing on migrant community, them not having access to their jobs. So an economic impact is a significant impact into you. So that's one piece of it. So economic, well-being, which translates to lack of food security and so on. That's one observation. Another one could be lack of access to healthcare because of the lockdown in that community. The third observation could be about, the social unrest in the community, because now all of these folks who have nothing else to do, they're just sort of cooped up in this, and then temperatures are flaring up, and maybe substance abuse could be one of the observations. Maybe domestic violence. So you start to put your observations together for each of these, whatever underserved group that you pick, and you try to dive deeper in within that. And then the other thing I want you to think about is to map the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders that have a role to play in solving their problems? So whether it's village council, the panchayat, is whether it's the state and central government organizations, whether it's clinicians in the community, whether it's employers potentially. I mean, there are a lot of different stakeholder groups that could potentially play a role. Your peers, your neighbors, for example, right? So start to lay out a stakeholder map, because you will need to actually find a way to interview them or get data from them. And so the better you understand that stakeholder group, the more effective it will be. So without further ado, let's break out. And so just me now, I'm going to come to your group as well, but I'm just going to go through all the groups briefly, but I'll definitely come to your group as well. With that, let's break out, get to know each other. Those of you who already done quite a bit of work on it, kudos. I'm glad you guys were able to do it. And let's take the time to actually get this right, and then we'll move on to the rest of the session, because then you can think from your target group's perspective, the rest of the materials that I'm going to be presenting. Harshita, Adesh, we can go ahead and we can get started with the breakout session.
All right, I'll open the breakout rooms now.
Yeah.
Okay, like a lot of people haven't logged in from their email ID that they did mention. So, okay, I'll have to do it manually, so it will take me a minute or so.
That's okay. And in the meanwhile, please send me questions on the chat window. So just mean I have some additional suggestions for you guys to do when you do the breakout. Harshita, the breakout session would be initiated by Adesh and Harshita. It seems like many of you have signed in using a different ID than what you had originally given, and I think breakout sessions were designed with those original email IDs. So I think they're really trying to figure out who goes where. So just hold on tight, Harshit. Technology. It's a big group, so normally when I teach this program, at Stanford, I have between 12 and 20 students in the class. So this is a much bigger group.